I knew my neighbors had crossed a line the morning I stepped into my backyard and felt my boots disappear into mud that had never been there before. Not after 11 years in that house. Not after every thunderstorm. Not after every spring downpour we'd ever had. At first, I just stood there staring at the water, trying to convince myself I was overreacting, because that's what reasonable people do, right? They look for innocent explanations before pointing fingers. But then I followed the water with my eyes, all the way to the back fence, and that's when I saw something that hadn't existed a month earlier. A brand new white drainage pipe sticking just under the fence line, angled ever so slightly toward my property. That tiny angle changed everything. And before I tell you how that pipe ended up becoming the biggest regret my neighbors ever had, let me tell you why I knew it wasn't an accident. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until all of this happened, my little house outside Maple Ridge had been exactly the kind of place I thought I'd grow old in. Nothing fancy, just a ranch-style home with a decent-sized backyard, a wooden deck I'd rebuilt myself over one long summer, and enough grass to keep me busy every Saturday morning. I wasn't one of those guys obsessed with a perfect lawn. If a few dandelions popped up, they popped up. Life's too short to fight flowers. But I took pride in keeping things neat because that yard had seen birthdays, cookouts, family reunions, and quiet evenings where I'd sit with a glass of iced tea after work listening to crickets instead of traffic. The neighborhood itself had always been peaceful. Folks waved when they drove by, borrowed ladders from each other, brought over cookies around Christmas. My old neighbor, Mr. Dalton, had lived behind me for almost 20 years before retiring to Arizona. He understood the land better than anyone because he'd watched the subdivision get built. One afternoon years earlier, he leaned against the fence while we talked about landscaping and said, "Your yard sits just a hair lower than mine, maybe 6 inches across the whole property. Nothing to worry about, though. The soil drinks it up." He was right. Every heavy rain sent a little runoff downhill, but it disappeared into the ground within a few hours. That's how nature worked around here. Nobody fought it because nobody tried to change it. Then Mr. Dalton sold his house. The new owners moved in before the moving truck had barely cooled off. Their names were Kyle and Vanessa Mercer, probably early 40s, successful, energetic, the kind of people who treated every project like it belonged on a home renovation show. Within days, contractors were everywhere. Excavators, pallets of stone, dumpsters, stacks of lumber, deliveries almost every morning before 8. They weren't just fixing the place up, they were transforming it. At first, I honestly admired the effort. New retaining walls went in. Expensive pavers replaced the old patio, raised flower beds appeared, outdoor lighting got installed, even a fancy fire pit with built-in seating showed up. My friend Rick came over one weekend, looked over the fence and laughed. "Man, they're spending more on that backyard than I spent on my first house." I laughed too because it was true. I figured good for them. Everyone deserves to enjoy their property however they want. Looking back now, I realized that's probably why I didn't notice the grading work happening beneath everything else. You see the pretty stone, the fresh mulch, the decorative shrubs. You don't pay attention to where the dirt goes. I certainly didn't. The contractors spent several days with skid steers moving soil around before laying the patio. I assumed they were leveling things out. I had no reason to believe they were raising almost the entire backyard by several inches. The first rain after construction finished came on a Tuesday night. Nothing unusual, just one of those steady spring storms that tap on the windows until morning. I made coffee the next day, grabbed my mug, walked outside like I always did, and immediately stopped halfway across the deck. The yard looked wrong. Water-covered patches of grass that had never held standing water before. My vegetable garden looked like someone had poured buckets into it. The ground near the fence had turned into thick brown soup. I remember kneeling down, scooping up a handful of mud, and thinking, that's strange. Maybe the ground just hasn't settled after winter. Maybe the rain was heavier than I realized. I wanted there to be an innocent explanation because once you start blaming neighbors, things rarely go back to normal. So I cleaned up what I could, stayed optimistic, and told myself not to jump to conclusions. 3 days later, the weather forecast called for another storm, and something in the back of my mind kept bothering me enough that instead of staying inside, I stood on my deck with a rain jacket on and watched the fence line as the clouds opened up. I had no idea that over the next few minutes I'd watch every doubt disappear along with any chance of pretending this was just bad luck. And that's exactly where everything truly began. I stayed out there a lot longer than any sane person would have that morning, getting soaked while staring at that pipe like it had personally insulted me. You know that feeling when you already know the answer, but you're still hoping your brain is wrong? That was me. Every few seconds, another surge of water shot out of that drain, hit the grass just inside my fence, and spread across my yard in a direction it had never traveled before. This wasn't runoff anymore. It wasn't gravity doing what gravity has always done. Somebody had collected every drop falling on their brand new patio, every ounce rolling off those raised beds, and sent it all through one pipe aimed straight at my property. I waited until the rain slowed, grabbed a shovel, and walked over to the fence line. The soil around the outlet was already washing away. Fresh mulch, little pieces of gravel, even bits of leaves from their landscaping had collected on my side. I remember laughing once, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes frustration comes out that way. Well, I muttered to myself, that's one way to decorate my backyard. I didn't want to fight. I really didn't. Living next to someone is different than arguing with a stranger. You still have to see each other taking out the trash, checking the mail, mowing the lawn. So later that afternoon, I walked around to their front door, rehearsing the conversation in my head. Keep it calm. Keep it simple. Give them a chance to fix it. Kyle answered, wearing work clothes, still holding a cordless drill. Before I could finish explaining, he glanced over my shoulder toward my yard like he already knew why I was there. Hey, I said, I think there's an issue with the drainage your contractor installed. Every time it rains, the pipe dumps everything into my backyard. He folded his arms. It's just stormwater. I know it's stormwater, I replied. The problem is where it's going. He shrugged. Water has to end up somewhere. I looked at him for a second, honestly waiting for the smile that would tell me he was joking. It never came. Sure, I said, but generally not on somebody else's property. He sighed like I was wasting his afternoon. The contractor said everything meets code. Maybe, I answered, but code doesn't mean my backyard becomes your retention pond. Before he could respond, Vanessa stepped onto the porch carrying a box from inside. She listened for maybe 10 seconds before saying, Our yard finally drains properly now. It used to stay wet for days. We're not tearing everything apart because of one puddle. One puddle. I almost invited them to walk over and count them. Instead, I nodded, thanked them for their time, and walked home. There wasn't any yelling. No threats. Somehow that made it worse. They had already decided the inconvenience belonged to me because fixing it would cost them money. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Kyle had said. Water has to go somewhere. He was right. It does. But people also choose where they send it. The next morning, I called a local survey company that had worked on several properties in our neighborhood over the years. The owner, an older guy named Frank Sullivan, came out 2 days later with a young assistant carrying equipment that looked expensive enough to make me nervous just watching it. Frank spent nearly 3 hours measuring elevations, shooting laser grades, checking property markers, and writing notes. Every now and then he'd stop, scratch his chin, and look back toward the Mercer's patio. Finally, he walked over holding a small notebook. You've got a legitimate concern, he said. See this? He showed me the numbers. The entire back section of their yard had been raised several inches during the remodel, and every new slope directed water toward that single outlet. Natural drainage is one thing, Frank continued. Artificially concentrating runoff and discharging it onto adjacent property, that's something else. I asked the question that had been sitting in my head all week. So what do I do? He smiled in that way experienced people do when they've seen the same problem 100 times. Depends what kind of neighbor you want to be. I laughed. I'd settle for a dry one. He laughed too. You could hire an attorney. You could file complaints. Or, he paused and pointed toward my yard. You could improve your own drainage. Protect your property first. Let everything else sort itself out afterward. That sentence stayed with me. Protect your property first. Not punish them. Not get revenge. Just stop the problem. A few days later, I met with a landscape contractor named Miguel Ortiz. Unlike the surveyor, Miguel didn't need hours. He walked the yard once, looked toward the pipe, then looked back at me. They're sending everything here, he said. Yep. Want to know the funny part? Sure. They're counting on your yard staying lower forever. He grabbed a stick, drew a rough sketch in the dirt, and explained exactly how we could reshape the back edge of my property without crossing the property line or violating any regulations. A retaining berm, a stone-lined drainage swale. Careful grading. Everything completely on my land. Every bit of water entering my property would be intercepted, redirected, and carried safely across the back boundary until it naturally exited at the lowest legal point. Will it flood them? I asked. Miguel shook his head immediately. No. It'll simply stop solving their drainage problem for free. I like that answer. It felt fair. Work started the following Monday. By 8 in the morning, trucks were unloading compacted fill, limestone blocks, crushed stone, and equipment. Neighbors slowed down while driving past. A couple even wandered over pretending to walk their dogs just to watch. Kyle eventually stepped into his backyard, coffee mug in hand. "What's all this?" he called over the fence. I smiled politely. "Just fixing my yard." He leaned against the railing, watching the excavator shape the soil. "Looks expensive. Probably cheaper than replacing my lawn every year." He didn't answer. For the next 2 days, the crew transformed the entire back section of my yard. They built a broad retaining ridge that blended naturally into the landscaping instead of looking like a wall. Behind it, they carved a shallow stone channel that curved gently along the fence, almost decorative if you didn't know what it was designed to do. Miguel explained every step while I watched. "Water always follows the easiest path," he said. "You don't fight it. You simply give it a better option." By Wednesday afternoon, everything was finished. Fresh sod covered the disturbed ground. Decorative river rock filled the drainage channel. If you hadn't watched it being built, you'd think it had always been there. Then the forecast called for another heavy storm arriving Friday night. Miguel packed up his tools, climbed into his truck, and before driving away, he rolled down the window and grinned. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "you're going to learn whether your neighbors understand how gravity works." I watched his taillights disappear down the street, looked back at the fence one more time, and for the first time since this whole mess had started, I actually found myself looking forward to the rain. By the time the next storm rolled across town, I wasn't nervous anymore. I was curious. That's a strange feeling when you've spent weeks watching your own backyard slowly turn into somebody else's drainage basin. Curiosity meant I finally believed I'd done everything I could on my side of the fence. Around 2 in the morning, thunder rattled the windows hard enough to wake me up. I almost laughed to myself because, for the first time in weeks, my first thought wasn't, "I wonder how bad my yard is going to look tomorrow." Instead it was, "Let's see if the plan actually works." I made coffee before sunrise, walked onto the deck with my favorite old mug, and stood there listening to the rain. It was still coming down steadily. Water streamed off the gutters, the trees swayed in the wind, and everything smelled like fresh earth. Then I looked toward the back fence. That white pipe was working exactly the way it always had. A strong stream poured out without slowing down for a second. The difference was what happened after that. Instead of spreading across my lawn, the water struck the retaining ridge, settled into the stone channel, and quietly followed the path Miguel had designed. No splashing, no erosion, no muddy river cutting through my grass. It simply moved with purpose until it reached the lowest point that naturally existed along the edge of both properties. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't destructive. It was just physics finally doing its job without using my backyard as a shortcut. About 10 minutes later, I noticed movement behind the fence. Kyle stepped outside wearing boots and a rain jacket. He looked toward the pipe first, then toward the corner of his patio. Even from where I stood, I could tell something had caught his attention. Water had begun collecting near the edge of the new pavers. Not deep enough to damage anything, but enough that every step sent little ripples across the surface. He stared at it for a long moment, then slowly turned his head toward my yard. Our eyes met across the fence. Neither of us said a word. There wasn't any need to. We both understood exactly why things looked different. The water wasn't coming back because I had sent it there out of spite. It was staying on his side because I had stopped accepting it on mine. There's a big difference between those two ideas, and I think that's the part a lot of people miss. I went back inside, finished my coffee, and spent the rest of the morning reading while the rain continued. Around lunchtime, the storm finally moved east. I walked my property from one end to the other. The grass was wet, but healthy. My vegetable beds hadn't washed away. The mulch stayed where it belonged. The flower border along the fence looked exactly like it had before the rain started. It felt like getting my home back. 3 days later, there was a knock at my front door. When I opened it, Kyle was standing there by himself. He looked tired. Not angry, just tired. "Got a minute?" he asked. I nodded and invited him around back. We stood near the fence looking at the drainage channel. He kicked at one of the stones with the toe of his boot before speaking. I've been dealing with standing water near the patio ever since you finished this. I nodded. I figured you might. He rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. I guess I didn't realize how much water was actually leaving our yard. Most people don't, I said. You only notice it when it becomes somebody else's problem. He looked over at me and gave a small, embarrassed smile. Fair enough. That was probably the first honest moment we'd shared since he'd moved into the neighborhood. After another long silence, he asked, "What would you do if this was your place?" I appreciated the question because it wasn't defensive anymore. It wasn't an argument. He was finally looking for a solution instead of someone to blame. I'd call the contractor, I said. Have the outlet rerouted into the proper drainage system or build a dry well. There are a dozen ways to fix it without sending everything downhill onto someone else's property. He nodded slowly. That's probably what I should have done from the start. Probably. He looked like he wanted to say something else, then stopped himself. Finally, he held out his hand. I owe you an apology. I shook it. I wasn't looking for an apology, I replied. I just wanted my backyard back. Less than 2 weeks later, another contractor's truck pulled into his driveway. This crew looked a lot different from the first one. Before digging anything, they spent hours measuring elevations and marking utility lines. They removed the original pipe, installed underground drainage that connected to an approved collection point, and regrade part of the landscaping so runoff spread naturally instead of concentrating in one place. It wasn't cheap. You could tell from the amount of work involved. But it was the right solution, and honestly, I respected the fact that Kyle finally chose to do it correctly instead of trying to argue his way around it. The following weekend, I was trimming hedges when he walked over carrying 2 cold bottles of root beer. He handed me one and said, "Consider this a peace offering." We stood by the fence talking for almost half an hour. For the first time, we weren't discussing drainage, contractors, or property lines. We talked about fishing, football, and how expensive everything had gotten over the last few years. It struck me that none of this ever had to become a neighborhood feud. One bad decision, followed by pride, had created weeks of unnecessary tension. If we'd started with that conversation instead of the shrug and the excuses, we probably would have saved everyone time and money. These days, every time a heavy storm passes through, I still glance toward the back fence out of habit. The drainage channel is usually dry within an hour. My lawn stays healthy. His patio stays dry. The neighborhood stays quiet. That's really the ending I wanted all along. Not revenge, not embarrassment, just a solution that respected where one property ended and another began. Looking back, I think the biggest lesson wasn't about drainage at all. It was about boundaries. Physical boundaries are easy to see on a survey map. Personal boundaries are harder. The moment someone decides their convenience matters more than your peace of mind, those lines start to blur. Sometimes the best response isn't to yell louder or threaten lawsuits. Sometimes it's to calmly reinforce your own boundary so clearly that the problem has nowhere else to go except back to the person who created it. I'd love to hear what you think. If your neighbor had dismissed your concerns the way mine did, would you have gone straight to an attorney, or would you have tried solving it the way I did first? Let me know in the comments because I honestly think reasonable people can disagree on that. And if you enjoy stories about real neighborhood conflicts, property disputes, and satisfying resolutions built on patience instead of chaos, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who's ever had a neighbor test their patience. I'll see you in the next one.